Stoic philosophy in 2 minutes is brought to you. Epictetus lived in Greece from 341 to 270 BC, and one of his most famous quotes is this: "Who am I? I am the type of man who isn't put there by women." Now, when we hear that quote, we think, oh, he must have been a Stoic philosopher who didn't care about women, right? But actually, it's just the opposite. He actually cared so much about women that he was worried that they were ruining men. He believed that women were making men weak and effeminate. Now, this video could go in any number of directions, but I want to read you some quotes from Epictetus and then I'll explain why he said what he said and why it matters for us today. Here we go. The first thing a woman can do to make a man feel humiliated is to take an interest in him or seek out his company. The second way is to show she wants him and longs for him. The third is to make herself appear more beautiful than she really is. The fourth is to seem modest and demure. The fifth is to pretend to be bashful and unassuming. The sixth is to let him see that she needs him. The seventh and final way is for her to turn from being hard to turn and submit herself easily. Now, if you're thinking, well, that's pretty self-explanatory, stay tuned, because I think this is going to get a little bit deeper. But here are a couple more. Women have made men soft. There is no creature so feminine in character as man is, nor so lacking in self-respect, so little able to endure hardship or to abstain from pleasure. Men used to be harder than women, but now women have become harder than men. Men nowadays, instead of being better than women, have become like them. In fact, they're even worse, for they are not content with being like women, but try to be more feminine than women. So what did Epictetus mean here? Why does he talk about women like this? Well, let's unpack these ideas, starting with the idea that women make men weak. One of the core tenets of Stoic philosophy is that we should strive to be strong. And strength, for the Stoics, comes in two varieties. It's physical strength and mental strength. You know, they believed that a good Stoic had to be physically fit, but also had to be mentally resilient and emotionally disciplined. But here's the kicker. They believed that women undermined both kinds of strength. Physically, women were seen as inherently weaker than men, and they could sap a man's energy by demanding protection or assistance, thus making men soft and less strong. Mentally and emotionally, women were thought to cause turmoil and distraction, disrupting a man's inner peace and focus. And in their distractions, men would lose their self-control and act irrationally. That's what he means when he says that men nowadays are worse than women. Not only are they not embodying the strengths that they should, but they are actually displaying more weakness and more femininity than women themselves. Now, that sounds crazy. We look at people like Julia Mirander. We look at Queen Zenobia. We look at Cleopatra. We look at all these powerful women, and we say, how could Epictetus possibly say something like this? But it's not that simple. Here's why. You see, despite these occasional, powerful women that we might point to, Epictetus believed that women as a whole were inferior to men. This was not just because of their physical weakness, but because of their supposed lack of reason. See, for the Stoics, women were seen as being more susceptible to emotions and less capable of rational thought. They believed that women were too flighty and inconsistent to be trusted in positions of power or authority. And because of this perceived lack of rationality, Epictetus argued that women should be subordinate to men, and that men should avoid getting too close to them because they would disturb their inner peace. Now, you can imagine that this view would have been very common in ancient times. Men were seen as the rational ones, and women were seen as the emotional ones. And because of that, men should be the leaders, the decision-makers, and women should fall in line behind them. But let's be honest, this sounds super sexist, and it is. But there's another layer here. You see, the Stoics weren't just talking about women in general. They were also talking about hetairae, and you might be asking, who are they? The word hetaira in ancient Greek literally meant companion. However, in practice, it carried a much more specific and scandalous meaning. A hetaira was a female sex worker who often had a higher social status than other prostitutes because they catered to an elite clientele. So they were a bit more classy, but still, they were considered immoral because they were engaging in the selling of sex. In fact, a lot of these sayings from Epictetus come from his discussion of this one particular hetaira. One of his students, a guy named Bato, developed feelings for this woman, and then he started missing his philosophy sessions. So he went to Epictetus and asked him, should he break off relations with this woman? And Epictetus gave him this advice. And that's where these sayings come from. Now, you can imagine that the relationship between a philosopher and his student wasn't exactly like a priest and a penitent. I mean, Epictetus wasn't running some sort of hotline for men with sexual problems. These sayings were part of a larger philosophical discussion about virtue, self-control, and the dangers of desire. And it's interesting because when we hear these sayings taken completely out of context, they sound incredibly misogynistic. But in context, we see that Epictetus is really teaching us about self-control and resisting temptation. Because to the Stoics, things like wealth, power, and sex were dangerous because they could corrupt you. And that's what he's getting at here. He doesn't hate women. He's saying that women can be dangerous. And that's not to say that there aren't plenty of powerful women out there, but he's saying, don't get distracted by them. Don't get caught up in the things that will lead you away from virtue. But here's the problem. As we evolve as a society, these sayings have evolved as well. In ancient Greece, the role of women was very different than it is today. Today, women have access to more opportunities than ever before. They are breaking barriers and smashing expectations. But what happens when we take these timeless pieces of advice and apply them to modern women? Are we simply upholding traditional values, or are we perpetuating harmful stereotypes? I think the answer is that it depends. It depends on how we interpret these sayings and how we apply them to our lives. If we see women as equals and partners, then we can learn from Epictetus's advice on self-control and resisting temptation. If we understand that the same temptations that women face, men also face, and that it's not just women who need to control their emotions and desires, but that we all do, then we can learn from this. However, if we see women as inferior, or if we think that they are the source of our problems, then we are doing a disservice to both ourselves and to women everywhere. The Stoics weren't misogynists. In fact, I'd argue that they were actually ahead of their time in some ways that they recognized the equality of the sexes, and that they believed that women should be treated as equals. But they also believed that women were human beings, just like men, and that they were capable of the same vices and virtues. And that's what this passage is really about. It's not about hating women. It's about recognizing the strengths that we should all strive for, both male and female, and avoiding the weaknesses that hold us back. And that's what I take away from this particular passage from Epictetus. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Stoic Philosophy in 2 minutes. If you did, please consider hitting the like button, subscribing, commenting, doing all those things that help us grow, and that help me keep making these videos for you. And as always, I'll see you tomorrow.